Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Claire Kim, your MC for today's lecture. It is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all to the 83rd Societas Koreana lecture meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Darcy Paquet at the Busan Asian Film School, who is going to give us an insightful lecture translating Parasite, the many challenges of film subtitle translation, which seems so intriguing theme for all of us. No further delay, please welcome him with a warm round of applause.
Okay, thank you very much to the Academy of Korean Studies for inviting me today. This is a topic that I've been involved with subtitle translation for a number of years now. It does seem that recently that more attention has been paid to subtitle translation and to the importance of subtitle translation. And so for me, that's been a rewarding experience, I think. And I would like to share with you today, partly a little bit about just the process of subtitle translation, but also in particular how to handle specifically Korean content in translation. And I'd like to speak about how subtitle translation is a particular kind of translation as compared to other, as opposed to literary translation or other examples like that. So today basically I'll speak briefly on these following topics, on the subtitling process, the importance of keeping things concise in subtitle translation. In particular, I want to focus on translating culture, particular challenges with Parasite, and then issues like translating humor and the difference between translating novels and translating films. So very briefly on the subtitling process. Typically the subtitling process, it starts before a film is finished. Often this is because of film festival deadlines or other deadlines that the producers need to meet before the film is 100% complete. Sometimes it's the director or the producer who reaches out and finds a translator. Other times it's the company that represents the film. And in particular, there are a number of international sales companies in Korea whose job it is to market and sell Korean films abroad. And typically they know a network of translators and they reach out to a translator that they know and hire them. The process is actually fairly simple. It's different in every country, but in Korea what typically happens is that the translator will receive a copy of the film either as a streaming link or as a downloadable file, and then just a long list of the dialogue, kind of an unformatted list. And the process of translating is first to format it and to divide it up into parts, and then just to write the translation underneath. So this is an example of what it usually looks like for me. So on the left side is the dialogue list that I would typically receive from the production company. Sometimes if there's a very long sentence, then I'll go through and I'll decide where to divide it up into different parts. This is referred to as spotting. And then on the right side, just after the dialogue is divided up, then I write the translation underneath. There's a whole technical process of putting the subtitles onto the image, and that's usually handled separately by a specialist. For me, the ideal time to do a subtitle translation is about 2 weeks. Sometimes, because of deadlines and rushing to submit a film to a festival, it may be necessary to rush the translation a bit. But with 2 weeks, I find that I have enough time to do a first draft and then to go through it a couple more times and to make the best subtitles that I possibly can. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in doing subtitle translation is keeping the translation concise, because subtitles flash on the screen very quickly, and the audience may not have time to read the subtitles if the translation is too long. And so partly it's it's the process of expressing meaning in the shortest amount of words possible. And it's not a skill that comes naturally. I think that with some experience, it tends to become somewhat easier. So experience does help in terms of doing subtitles. And also, you have to make decisions sometimes about what to emphasize or what to leave out in a particular translation. And so subtitles need to be concise. I also do focus a lot on keeping them fairly easy to understand. If they are being flashed onto the screen very quickly, then if the audience can understand it in an immediate fashion, then and they don't have to sit and ponder for a second about the sentence construction or the meaning of the sentence, then it allows them to focus more on the film itself. And so just some examples of that. I tend to avoid phrases that have two meanings in English. So this isn't the best example, but I'm going to tell her, for example, could mean I'm going to a certain place in order to tell her something. Or it could mean just I intend to tell her in the future. And probably from context, it's clear which one it means. But if you can just avoid these kind of phrases altogether, then it makes it much easier, I think, for the audience to immediately understand what is happening. And I also tend to use, for example, single word verbs like argue, rather than these kind of short verb phrases like talk back, because the meaning is immediately clear and kind of easier for the brain to process. And I do think it's important to remember that often the audience for Korean cinema, if it screens at a film festival or in any country around the world, there'll be a certain percentage of the audience that may be native speakers of English, but there may be a quite large percentage of the audience who are not native speakers. And so when it's not necessary, I try to avoid slang or overly obscure or difficult language, just to make it a little bit easier on the audience. And of course, you do try to keep the translation as expressive as possible. And so the challenge, I guess, is to try to write a bit like Hemingway in using simple words and sentences, but expressing as much as possible with those simple words. Often when I'm in the revising process, after I finish my first draft and then I go through a second time, this is often what I end up doing is rewriting phrases to make them shorter and to express more or less the same thing. So she's going to let us know next week can be rewritten as she'll tell us next week. It's much easier to read. It is true, however, that compromise is something that's inevitable in subtitle translation. Often when I see a line of dialogue, I may think of my ideal translation that I think best expresses the full meaning and nuance of the original. And then I put it onto the screen, and it's always too long. And so it's quite common that you have to end up choosing actually a slightly worse translation that is more concise, that is easier to read, and which keeps the audience in the film rather than giving them something that's a little bit too much to process as they're watching the film. And so subtitle translation can be difficult for perfectionist personalities. I think that you have to get used to doing a lot of compromise. Okay, translating culture is the next topic that I'd like to discuss. And I think it's quite common while doing these translations that I'll come across something that the Korean audience will be very familiar with, but that an international audience may or may not be familiar with. And this ranges from the very simple to references to people. These are some examples of this kind of thing. Would you lend me 500,000 won? Or I packed some soju for our picnic. Your boyfriend looks like Lee Byung-hun. And for the Korean audience, these are very easy to understand and quite simple. But when you think about this from the perspective of an international audience, some may know how much 500,000 won is. Others may not be familiar with Korea and its currency and may think that it's an incredibly large amount of money. Soju is something that I think when I first started translating, or initially I started with proofreading subtitles about 20 years ago. I think at that time, soju was less well known internationally. I think it's much more well known now. But on the other hand, there will be some smaller percentage of the audience that has never heard of soju and may not know what it is. And the same goes for Lee Byung-han. He's becoming more and more well-known internationally now. But it is a question of percentages. Some percentage of the audience will know who he is, and some will not. There's a question always, or a dilemma that comes up with this kind of translation. And it's, how do you handle this? How do you make sure that the audience can understand it? One potential solution is to exchange or to replace this reference to local culture with something that's more easily understood internationally. I think there is a real, there can be issues with that. And personally, I do think there's something a bit uncomfortable in erasing the Korean content and replacing it with something that is more broadly recognizable. I mean, you could say your boyfriend looks like Brad Pitt, and it would be easy to understand the point of the sentence, but certainly Brad Pitt and Lee Byung-han are very different, and I don't like changing those when it's not necessary. But I think in every situation, you have to consider the particular scene in which this dialogue takes place. And for me, there are kind of three things that I consider in particular. So the first one is, how important is it that the audience understands in a very detailed way, the meaning of the reference? So, like, would you lend me 500,000 won? Is this a situation where this request is telling us something about the character's personality? If that's the case, then we do want to find some way to communicate roughly how much money this is. On the other hand, if we're at a scene in a convenience store and somebody's, buying a bit of banana milk or something, and we don't need to know exactly how much that costs. And so in that case, it probably is no problem to leave it as won rather than changing it into dollars or euros. There are also cases where the meaning may be clear in context. So I packed some soju for our picnic, for example. If the next scene we see them at their picnic and they're drinking these green bottles and everybody is getting drunk, then I don't think it's that necessary to explain for the audience what soju is. They'll be able to see this from context. And the last one is there some room to provide a little bit of explanation in the translation? So with the final example, it's a somewhat awkward translation, but your boyfriend is as hot or as good-looking as Lee Byung-han. This makes it very clear that Lee Byung-han is some kind of good-looking celebrity and not perhaps a politician. If Lee Byung-han were a politician who's not very good-looking, then this could be an insult rather than a compliment. But by putting a little bit of extra into the translation, then it makes it clear what the meaning of this is. And so in each case, when I come across this kind of content, then these are the kind of questions that I ask myself and the potential solutions for that. I'll mention just a couple examples that I came across in translating various films. This film is The Himalayas from 2015. Himalaya is the Korean title. And there's a scene where the main character in the middle part of the film receives some very bad news. He's a mountaineer, but he's injured, and his doctor recommends that he stops climbing mountains. And so he's quite depressed. And we see him late at night sitting in his kitchen, drinking a bottle of soju, with no food, no side dishes. And his wife comes in and kind of gives him a look and says, "Anju do opshi." And actually this is, in one sense, it's quite a simple phrase. You could just translate it literally as no side dishes, but I think a little bit more was needed because in many countries it's quite common to drink alcohol without any food, and this is not considered to be particularly unusual. Whereas in Korea, it looks bad. It makes him look more kind of pathetic in a sense, and the look of frustration on his wife's face expresses part of this. But to try to find a translation that was appropriate for the situation was quite difficult. And I don't think there's a perfect solution. I ended up translating this as "at least eat something." And then in the scene, we see her go to the refrigerator and take out some food and put it down. And again, it wasn't really possible to explain about the Korean context and why she will look upon him in the way that she does in this situation. But I think a little bit of her frustration comes out in the translation, "at least eat something." There's another film called Beyond These Mountains from earlier this year. And there's a priest who starts to tell a story to two young boys. And so he says, "I'll tell you an old story. 옛날 얘기 하나 해줄게요. 옛날 얘기라 그래서 호랑이 담배 피던 시절 얘기 아니고요." This is a phrase that's used similar to "once upon a time" to kind of introduce a story or to begin telling an old folktale or an old story. And I remember after I came to Korea the first time I heard this expression, and I found it to be quite really interesting and creative, and the image is very, very strong. And so in one sense, this is the kind of translation that I would ideally like to keep within a subtitle translation. But actually, again, this is an example how in every scene you have to kind of consider the particular context in which it takes place. I think that there are two possible translations here, but it's not an old folk tale about tigers smoking pipes. The more literal translation, or B, it's not an old fairy tale set once upon a time. Actually, if you look at the scene itself, the tigers smoking pipes is not really the point of the scene, and it's something that the Korean audience will not really focus on. The point that the character is saying is that, I'm going to tell you a story, and this is set in the past, but it's not so far in the past that it doesn't have any bearing on the present. In fact, it's this long flashback, about 10 minutes long, and we find out at the end that it has some personal connection to the boys that he's speaking to. And my concern was that if I chose translation A, that for the next 10 or 15 seconds, the audience might just be thinking about tigers and pipes. And this image is so strong. And I can imagine that if I were seeing this for the first time as well, this is how I would respond to this translation. And the thing is that the sentence that comes right after the sentence is very important. It sets up some crucial information about the story that's about to follow. And so ultimately I felt that it was a bit of a problem to use translation A because I thought it would distract the audience and it would cause them to miss the important information that came next. On the other hand, translation B felt a little bit too Western for me. I ended up going with kind of a middle option in this case. And so I translated it as, but it's not an old folktale about tigers and rabbits, since many Korean folktales feature tigers and rabbits, and this is not quite as distracting a translation. Unfortunately, it's not as interesting a translation, but I think within the context of the film, this was the right choice for this situation. So in translating Parasite, this was a very interesting experience for me. I had worked with director Bong Joon-ho in the past, but I think of all the directors I work with, he's the one who is most focused on the details of the translation, and he gives it a tremendous amount of thought. In fact, before I even started the translation, I received like a 4-page email from him containing all of his ideas and thoughts about the challenging bits of dialogue that we would have to translate in the film. And there were a lot of challenges. So, for example, there's a scene where a particular character is imitating a North Korean news anchor and speaking in the very particular kind of intonation that we see from clips of North Korean news broadcasts. And this is something that the South Korean audience would recognize quite easily, I think. For the international audience, she's speaking about North Korea and about Kim Jong-un, and so in one sense they'll more or less get a sense of what she's doing. But I wanted the translation to be a bit more specific, to give them a hint of who exactly she is imitating in this scene. And a literal translation would not have done that. And so in this case, her husband responds to her imitation. And I think that a literal translation would have just been something like, you're the best at doing these North Korean jokes. And instead I wrote it as, nobody can imitate North Korean news anchors like you. And so this is an example of kind of adding a bit of explanation into the translation. And then we came to a scene that, a line of dialogue that was quite famous, it's quite funny. 서울대 학교 문서 위주 학과 뭐 이런 거 없나. And actually this one is a case where we did ultimately decide to change the reference to Seoul National University to an international university. In one sense, this was the director's decision, and I didn't really have a choice in the matter, but we did discuss this. And I think because this is a joke, and it's something that needs to be understood immediately for the humor to really work as well as it could. And also there's the fact that people who are not familiar with Korea may not recognize that Seoul National University is considered the top university in Korea. And the fact that it is a very good university is part of the humor as well. So in this case, we decided to change it to an international university. And the joke seems to work better by making this substitution. The director asked me, should we do Harvard, should we do Oxford? Oxford seems a little bit more of an interesting translation. Harvard seems like an obvious choice. And so we settled on Oxford. There is also a reference to Kakao Talk in the early part of the film. This was another one where the director was quite clear that he wanted to change it to either Messenger or to WhatsApp. And we ended up going with WhatsApp. I can imagine that the executives at Kakao Talk probably hate me because this could have been an opportunity to get a lot of free publicity. Although we didn't know at the time that we were doing the translation that there would be so much, that it would stir up such a storm abroad. And so there are a number of different cases like that within Parasite. Another question I often get is how to handle dialect in translation. And I think this is a very thorny issue, and it's something that there are a lot of potential problems when you try to translate dialect in too direct a manner. It's interesting that I've spoken with translators of Japanese subtitles, people who translate Korean films and do the Japanese subtitles for Korean films. And actually in Japanese, this kind of dialect is much easier to handle than in English. I think just because there are different kind of traditions in terms of expressing dialect in written language. In English, I think the situation was perhaps different 100 or 200 years ago. If we read Mark Twain, we can see how he expresses dialect in a very direct way through written language. But this has fallen out of fashion in the US to the point where it feels a bit either distracting or awkward or sometimes even offensive to write out dialect in such a direct way, to change the spelling. And you can do it in a subtle way, perhaps, but to try to do it too much in too obvious a way can be quite distracting. And there's also the issue of which dialect do you choose. If the characters in a film are speaking with a Busan dialect, do you translate it into an Australian dialect or an Indian dialect? Or what dialect do you choose? Many translators have chosen kind of an African-American dialect, and this is something that I tend to avoid as well because it can sound offensive, I think, if you're not careful. And so here too, when I'm translating a film that has a lot of dialect, I do try to consider the situation. If everybody in the film is speaking the same dialect, then I think there could be a good argument for the fact that you don't really need to try to translate this in the dialogue, because from the perspective of the characters, everybody's speaking with a standard kind of speech. Even if, for the sole audience, when they watch the film, they will be experiencing this as a different dialect. But there are certain scenes where you'll have a character from perhaps Chola province who's in Busan, and the difference in dialects becomes something that is part of the scene. And in this case, I think you do have to try to express it in the translation. Usually I try to express it kind of as standard and non-standard dialect in a very abstract way, rather than specifically choosing one dialect. But different translators handle this in a different way. But certainly there's some things that are very difficult to handle in translation. I think that as a translator, you have to be aware of what you can do and what you can't do. And dialect is one of these cases, which is the eternal headache, I think, for translators. There were some other interesting issues that came up while translating Parasite. Translating names was one example. And here too, I think Bong Joon-ho is a director who has given this more thought than perhaps any other director that I know. Years ago, we were working on the subtitles of his movie Mother. And in that case, there's a character who appears early in the film. He's kind of briefly on screen, and he's identified, his name is Jong-pal. And then later, towards the end of the film, he ends up becoming an important part of the plot, but he doesn't appear on the screen again. And people refer to his name in dialogue. But the audience needs to remember who this is. I think for the Korean audience, it's quite easy to remember a name like Jong-pal. But for non-Korean speakers, it's more difficult to remember and to distinguish between different Korean names. And so Director Bong was concerned that if the audience didn't remember who Jong-pal was, this could cause a problem for the audience in the second part of the film. And so actually it was his suggestion to translate his name not as Jong-pal but as Crazy JP, which is quite an unusual translation. It does kind of fit his personality. When you watch the film, there's something a bit crazy about him. But Crazy JP is something that you can't forget. You hear it once. And so in this sense, later in the film, when they're talking about Crazy JP, there's no problem at all in remembering who this was. In Parasite, it wasn't quite as extreme an example, but the character of Min-hyuk is one who appears early in the film, and then is discussed later in the film, although the actor himself doesn't appear after the opening scenes. And in this case, we went with a more simple solution. We didn't call him Crazy Min-hyuk like that. We just called him Min. And he's the one character who has a single syllable name in the film. And I think this makes it a little bit easier to distinguish his name from the other names in the film. But yeah, names is another thing that, at first glance, it seems like a very easy thing to translate. But if you think about how that name fits within the overall storytelling in the film, then it may make sense to translate it in a slightly different way. There were certain repeated phrases in the film, like kise or kewek, 상징적이다. Because they're repeated, in particular because there's one character who tends to listen to the dialogue of people around him and then repeat that dialogue later. It was important to use the exact same phrasing for each time. And so a word like 상징적이다, you might translate it as metaphorical or symbolic, but we had to choose one and stick with it throughout the course of the film. One other thing that the director did for me in his 4-page email before I started was to explain a little bit about the relationships between the characters. And actually for a translator, this was very useful for me to understand that the rich family, for example, the married couple, in one sense they're close. In some ways, however, the wife is somewhat scared of her husband, and there is this particular power dynamic between them. And by keeping that in mind as you're doing the translation, it can help to express a bit of their relationship through the language that they use when they're speaking to each other. Translating humor is always a fun challenge, I think, but not an easy challenge. And I think partly because, as I mentioned before, you have to make sure that it's easy to understand very quickly and at a glance. If it takes a second to ponder the meaning of the phrase itself, then the humor may be lost. But also there's this whole issue of timing. And timing is something that I didn't really think about very much when I was first starting doing subtitles. But the more I worked on it, the more I thought about timing. And I think that there is something really particular about subtitle translation and timing that is worth kind of thinking about for translators. One thing that I noticed while attending international film festivals that I found quite interesting was that, for example, I went to a film festival in Italy and was watching a Korean film with a big audience, with almost no Korean speakers in the audience. And when there was a funny line of dialogue, I noticed that the audience would all laugh at the same time. And it wasn't at the moment that they read the punchline in the subtitles, but it was at the moment that the actor delivered the punchline. And even though they didn't understand Korean, they could hear in the actor's voice this release of tension, and they could see on the actor's face. And in a sense, the audience waited for that moment. And then when that tension was broken, then everybody laughed together. Thinking about that drove home the point to me that translating subtitles is something very different from translating a book, other kinds of translation, because it goes together with the performances. And this is the last main point that I'd like to make, is to think about the differences between subtitle translation and literary translation or other kinds of translation. When you translate a novel, then the translation replaces the original novel. Of course, it is possible for people who speak both languages to look simultaneously at the Korean and the English to compare the translation. But that's not typically how people will read the translation. They'll simply be reading this text that has replaced the original text. And so it's a big challenge for the translator to try to recreate as much of the original as possible. But essentially you're writing a new work which takes its place. When you're watching a subtitled film, it's very different, I think, because even if the audience doesn't understand Korean, they can hear the actor's voice, they can hear the intonation, they can see their facial expression and body movement. And there's a lot of the emotion in their dialogue that comes through to the audience, even if they don't understand literally what the characters are speaking. And for that reason, the subtitle translation ends up being complementary rather than replacing the original. And when doing the translation, I think it's important to not only focus on the text, but also to focus to a certain extent on the acting and the performance, and to watch the scene itself and to get a sense of the mood of the scene and the emotions in the scene. Certainly, I think it's true that if the audience is watching the film and the emotion that they're feeling from the screen, if it doesn't match the translation, they can sense that something is wrong. If the translation is not emotional enough, we can see that the actors are very emotional, but the translation feels very flat, then you do feel a sense that something is wrong. The opposite is sometimes true as well. The actor may be delivering a line in a very cool kind of way, and the translation might be too enthusiastic. And in this case, you get the same kind of discomfort from the audience. And so part of the challenge in doing subtitle translation is, I think, trying to match the emotions in each scene with the dialogue. When I first started subtitle translation, I tried very hard to express every nuance and every bit of the original dialogue. Although I realized somewhat later that you can be somewhat minimal in subtitle translation because the emotion is filled in by the performance. And so you don't always need to express every tiny detail in the subtitles. If you can give the audience the information that they need and also make the emotion in the translation match the emotion on the screen, then they'll feel connected to the scene, I think, in a way that they wouldn't if the subtitle translation doesn't match. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a silly metaphor, but I feel kind of like a tailor, making custom clothes as I'm working on subtitles, because it's not simply that you want to make a very nice suit, but the suit needs to match the original very well in order for a good subtitle translation to appear. So this is my talk. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I look forward to kind of speaking a bit more in the interview that we'll do today. So thank you.
It was so intriguing and informative, and personally, it was so great lecture for me. Thank you so much, Professor Darcy Paquet. It is now time to wrap up this lecture with Professor Paquet. Thank you so much for your lecture again. So this is the end of today's meeting of the 83rd Societas Koreana lecture meeting. I'd like to thank you all of you for being with us today. Thank you.